All right.
Hi, Steve Harkadon. Oh, hi, Dana. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. This is another special thanks to our conference sponsors. Really appreciate all the support. This is a chance for you to let us know where you're participating from. Look for the star to the left of the map. Click on that and then click on the map. Feel free to shout out in the chat as well. It's awfully fun to hear it in the chat.
Recording started.
Seattle, Atlanta, Texas, that's great. San Francisco.
Okay, Dana, take it away. Have a great session. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. And just a big thanks to both Steve and Lucy for making this happen. I think it's a really exciting opportunity to be able to connect with folks all over the country and the world. So thanks for being with me this morning. As Steve mentioned, if you'll forgive me for wearing a giant down coat, we have no heat in the office, and I am coming to you from Minnesota. Okay, I'm picking up that there's a bit of an echo. Okay. We'll try and adjust that if we can. Does this sound a little bit better for folks? Okay, no echo for Steve. So it's great to be with you, and as Steve mentioned, I'm a little under the weather and in a down coat because of no heat. So hopefully that doesn't distract from the presentation. What I'm going to be talking about today is integrating global competency into teaching and learning. And the first part of this session will really be to frame up that challenge. And it is going to be reviewing a global competency market research study, some of the data that came out of that looked at high school graduates in the U.S. So for those of you who aren't based in the United States, the data won't really be indicative of levels of global competency where you are, but nevertheless the findings are interesting and certainly the questions are relevant for any use anywhere. And then I'm going to be rolling into sort of how we define global competency, and then taking a look at some examples of how we document what it means to be teaching and learning in a globally competent way. So I want to begin. I also want to acknowledge that I've got support with me as a moderator. Charmaine Campbell-Patton, who is our National Program Manager, is going to be keeping an eye on your questions while we talk today, trying to consolidate them and make sure that they're flagged for me so that I can get to them. And at the end, we'll leave a little bit of time to hopefully address and dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues. So with that, I will begin. So the first thing I wanted to do was set a little bit of context. This presentation is not about World Savvy, but it's important to sort of let the group know where we come at this from. And so just to give a little bit of an overview about the work that we do. Our mission is to educate and engage youth in community and world affairs, and really looking to prepare them to thrive in what we know to be an interconnected and interdependent global society. So our approach has been sort of hallmark of integration and looking at this in an interdisciplinary way to promote and develop global competency in K-12 teaching and learning. And we do that through a number of ways: arts integration, project-based learning, international exchange, service learning, and professional development. So you'll be seeing some examples later in this presentation of examples from some of these programs, just to set some context for you about how these programs operate. Just a word or two on that. Our World Savvy Challenge program is a project-based learning program that allows teams of students in class to research complex global themes and come up with solutions to issues related to that theme at the local, national, and global level. They also take action in that program by implementing some of those solutions. The Media and Arts program is an opportunity for young people to use media and arts as a lens on complex global issues, and then also as a platform to express their own perspectives about those issues through visual and performing art and media. The American Youth Leadership Program is a State Department-funded initiative that's in its third year that gives an opportunity for 30 students and 5 teachers to travel to Bangladesh for a month each year. And they stay in homestays and they examine a variety of issues relating to climate there on the ground in Bangladesh, and then return to their home communities and implement social action projects related to that. And we'll hear more about that later. This year, Peru was also added to that cohort, so we're in process of identifying students to go to Peru and address food security there. The professional development we do, its hallmark is really looking at coaching and consulting. So we have a variety of workshops. Our programs kick off with these institutes for teachers, but really we believe in building educator capacity by supporting them over the long haul. So you'll hear reference to some of those best practices later in this as well. And then we do a fair amount of consulting, and that consulting work is actually a really interesting way to see what's happening in the landscape of global education. It spans from working with nonprofit partners like the World Monuments Fund or the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco or the San Francisco Arts Commission to schools and districts to customize needs in global education. And then finally, educational resources. So at the very bottom, you'll see where we're operational. We have offices in New York, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, which is most of who is served by these programs right now. But we are expanding online and bringing most of the programs that you see listed into an online environment so that students can participate in the coming years. So that's a little bit about us, and it hopefully helps to frame where we come at this issue. The next thing I'd like to do is to dive into just a glimpse of how we look at global competency. So there are 4 quadrants for us. Hopefully you can see my pointer here, that we sort of look at and assess. And if you look at this list, you may see indicators that you would have included that you don't see there, or one of the things at the outset I will say about defining and assessing global competency that we have found is it is such a dynamic concept, and it really is aspirational. So we really work to define and identify as many indicators as possible that sort of build these knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, and behaviors for global competence. But we believe that this entire area of thought and research is really evolving. So I'll say that as a way to remind us all how dynamic the concept really is. So if you have a look, we consider global competency to be the knowledge, the skills, the values and attitudes and behaviors that help us thrive in an interconnected, interdependent global society. So we're going to be running through each of these quadrants much more specifically after we review the survey data to give you a sense of knowing what we know about the baseline global competence of young Americans. What does it look like when we're actually moving the needle in one of these 4 quadrants to develop knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, or behaviors for global competence? So we will do that in a bit, and we will return to this slide. So to dive in next and set the frame for what we did over the summer, many of you on the call may remember and may have referred to at various times research that was done by National Geographic and Ropers in 2002 and 2006 that focused on geographic literacy was really the pivot point for that survey. And since then, there hadn't been many studies focused on this demographic to look at what were American students, graduates from high school in the U.S., what could we expect them to know and do and be able to do and how to behave with respect to global competence. So we conducted a market research study. We commissioned a market research study. It was conducted by Colligan Market Research in California over this past summer. And so you'll see there were 502 respondents from June 29th to July 6th, which matches the sample size almost exactly of the 2002 and 2006 studies. This was an 18 to 24-year-old group. The difference between past studies and this study is that they were required to have completed high school. So in the past, that hasn't been a prerequisite. And for us, we really wanted to know if you successfully complete high school education, whether that's a GED or not, what is it that you know and how do you behave with respect to global competence. And the audience demographics, there were quotas put in place to ensure that they matched the U.S. population for that age demographic. So that's a little about that methodology. and I can certainly take questions later on the methodology if should they arise. Excuse me. So one thing that I was, to frame the key findings at the 30,000-foot level, there were really 4 things that leapt out when we were looking at this data. So the first is that there was a shift, and that young Americans, the respondents in this survey, placed a value. They really placed a premium on learning globally. So there was a high demand among this group for global education, an appetite to be learning this way. And that was a little bit of a shift. There was more of a desire, and beyond that, kind of an acknowledgement of the importance and the relevance of global education and learning globally, and that's something that has shifted over the last 10 years. The second is that global issues are not regularly discussed in school. So this target audience, lots of folks in this conference are doing this quite well in so many places all over the world, and it's evidenced by even being in this conference and participating in this discussion. It's clear that these are probably not your classrooms, but by and large in the United States, the survey told us that global issues are not regularly discussed. The third is that knowledge of contemporary global issues are lacking. So and I'm down here, by the way, I should be using my pointer, sorry about that. So that's one area that we did not see any positive shift from years past. We had very similar tracking with what students knew and didn't know in terms of content knowledge. And then finally, there was a clear relationship between those who had exposure to global education in high school and their future interests and behaviors, and we'll dive into that in a moment. So moving ahead and building on some of these, just to take a look at what some of the data told us. With respect to valuing learning globally and having a high demand for global education, you see that 86% agreed that a solid foundation in world history and events is crucial in coming up with solutions to global problems. So there's a connection being made between the knowledge that they have and their capacity to be solution seekers and problem solvers. 90% believe that developments abroad had significant implications on the U.S. economy. This is shifting data as well. And 79% said it was important to be comfortable interacting with people of different cultural backgrounds. And the interesting thing is this was rated on par with things like writing skills, technical skills, and math skills, as you can see. You also note in this same category, this 12% represents the percentage of the total group of respondents who did indicate that they had exposure to global issues in some kind. So there were a variety of questions that sussed that out. 12% was the group that indicated they had the exposure. And within that, and within the whole respondent pool, we also saw that 80% of the entire pool indicated that they believed jobs were becoming more international, and a full 60 over here said that they would be better employees if they had an understanding of different world cultures. So, again, everyone in this environment is very conscious of how much this global skill set and knowledge base is becoming essential, but one of the things that we wanted this study to do was to demonstrate that our conversations about being college and career ready and sort of frame this as a workforce development issue, that the pipeline of Americans coming out of high schools really needed to be able to do more and know more to be successful in this new environment. So you see through this data a real acknowledgement among the respondents that this was important. So moving ahead, the next key finding was around how regularly these issues were discussed in school. One question that's come up in talking about this study is, someone did ask, well, is it significant? Okay, I'm going to slow down a little bit so that you can hear me better. One question that came up was that, is it significant? These questions asked students if they remembered this type of instruction. And so someone did make a point that, well, maybe a student just didn't happen to remember the day that was done in class. And my response to that, and I think it's important to remember, is we're really talking about how to holistically integrate global competency into instruction. And so if someone who's 18 to 24, just out of high school, doesn't remember any global instruction, that in and of itself is significant. So you see here that we had 48% actively disagreeing with the statement that their education provided instruction that helped them to understand the roots of global issues that affect their lives. 63% indicated they did not discuss world events in their high school, and a little over half indicated that only a little over half indicated that their teachers had incorporated this perspective into curricula. Again, this may not surprise very many of you on this conference. Excuse me. The next slide is really about knowledge. This, unfortunately, was one of the areas where the Global Competency Survey sort of tracked pretty similarly with what we saw in data that came out in 2002 and 2006. Very similar to past data, we had 78% of students didn't know Mandarin was the most commonly spoken language. Almost half thought it was English. 77% couldn't identify Canada as the U.S.'s largest trading partner. 72% couldn't identify which region Afghanistan is located in. And fewer than half know that Libya is located in northern Africa. And just over half knew what the Arab Spring was in reference to. So, you know, and these track pretty similarly. This 72% was 78% in 2006. So not really much improvement there. And given the amount of activity and you know, events happening on the ground in Afghanistan, that is significant. So here you see a graphic slide of some of this same data. So 66% also couldn't identify the Prime Minister of the UK, and you see here the language looking at Afghanistan identification and Libya. The next area, which we actually found to be incredibly positive, we were excited to see development in this area, and sometimes studies prove what seems logical or what you might already know. And what we did find was a relationship between those who had indicated they had exposure to global education in high school, which was around 12%, and their interests and behaviors in the future. So again, these are 18 to 24-year-olds who have graduated from high school, remarking on whether they had this kind of content or exposure, and 12% of them indicated that they had. So I think someone just drew on the screen. I'm not sure what happened there. I did not mean to do that. So here we've got the first item is that they are more likely to regularly or often discuss news and world events with other people. They were more likely to actively seek out news and information about world events. They were more likely to vote in local and national elections, to view diversity as an asset, to volunteer for a cause they believe in, and to be curious about the world around them. So these things to us have indicated that you're moving the needle when you're addressing global education around social and civic development. To the extent, you know, education, the purpose of education is to really develop great citizens, great leaders, people who have the ability to engage in a complex democracy. These are significant findings. Okay, so curious about going around. The other interesting note about this was that if you think, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, we focused a lot on trying to suss out behaviors, because there's still, the majority of respondents in this survey actually still get their news, this news you're seeing up here, from television, which was surprising, with online coming in second. And so to the extent that we know that most of the television coverage in the US is typically skewed to domestic issues with a very small percentage spent on international, this behavior of actively seeking out news and information about world events becomes that much more critical as a skill for global competence. So, and you can see graphically noted here some of those shifts in behaviors related to this study. So shifting gears from the study, I want to come back to looking at global competence, because I wanted to pull out some areas and some examples of how we're developing global competence, or how we see that happening in each of these quadrants. So you've seen this before in the beginning, and I'm just going to pull out each of these quadrants and talk a little bit about how we see that evidenced from what's happening in our programs. So the first here is knowledge, looking at developing global competency as sort of requisite knowledge being understanding the complexities and interdependencies of world events and issues, geographic knowledge, understanding historical forces that have shaped the current world system, and a knowledge of one's own culture and history in relationship to others. So these are just a few. As I mentioned in the beginning, there may be many of you who are practitioners in this realm that don't see every indicator of knowledge listed here. And as I said, global competency to us is incredibly dynamic and aspirational, so we reflect on this every year to see if it captures what we'd like it to capture. So just pulling out this knowledge framework here and looking at some of what's developed through that, I want to use an example of a STEM class right here in St. Paul, Minnesota, to talk a little bit about how they tackled this. So as I mentioned, and for those of you just joining the room, the World Savvy Challenge is a project-based learning model, which is very effective for looking at global issues in a classroom setting. So in this environment, this STEM class had students working in teams to essentially address an issue related to the theme of sustainable communities. So the theme for our youth programs for the last 2 years and the coming year, this year, has been looking at the economic, social, cultural, and environmental aspects of sustainability. So they chose to look at water quality and waterborne disease and to do a comparative analysis of Switzerland and Sierra Leone, data from those two countries about those issues. So they work in teams throughout the year. Those teams are typically a maximum of 7 students, and then they are encouraged to identify solutions that can be shared. Oh, I'm moving. Oh, here we go. Okay, it's back. So they're encouraged then to identify solutions at the local, national, and global level, and in their case, they decided to create a suite of solutions that might be used in developing countries. They presented these solutions and collaborated with other students when they came to the culminating event in the spring. So what's interesting about them developing this knowledge, and I think what project-based learning does so well and what the challenge does so well, is it makes those students owners of that knowledge by requiring them not only to absorb it, but to think comparatively and creatively about it, and then also to present it, to sort of confirm understanding, and to present it in a way that is persuasive. So this is an example of what, of sort of how some of the knowledge is being developed. These students finished this program with a really deep knowledge of these issues. Moving on, the skills part of this matrix. And again, for those of you just joining, we're referencing the 4 quadrants of a global competency matrix that helps to define how we look at work. And these are just examples of how that becomes visible, that learning becomes visible. So within the skills quadrant, I'll use an example of a math class in Redwood City, California. And actually, this is not, as it says, from the World Savvy Challenge. It is from our Media and Arts program. And since 2 of our Media and Arts program folks are joining this session, Elizabeth and Daniel, who do such great work, I apologize for that error. So in the Media and Arts program, as I mentioned, and what I didn't mention in the beginning is media and arts as a tool for exploring these issues is incredibly effective. And what we have found is moving it out of the context of these aren't art teachers that are doing this work. In fact, more than half of them tend to be teachers that are coming from other disciplines that find ways to use media and the arts to make learning visible and illuminate these connections. So in this case, this was a math class in Redwood City who was participating in the Media and Arts program. And they decided to frame an essential question around how much trash does our school produce in one day? And so their data collection pivoted around this essential question. They were utilizing geometry, ratio reasoning statistics, and they worked in groups to survey the trash receptacles around the campus of their school, which was a large campus, to estimate total volume contained in there. And then the way that they chose to share their results were in highly detailed scale models, portraits of these typical trash receptacles, to visualize those results and to share them with the rest of the community, so there was a quick and easy way to understand exactly what their footprint was with respect to trash production on campus. So that's an example of students utilizing pretty specific hard skills, and I should mention skills that are required in their math coursework, through data collection and then also building on that to share those results publicly to engage others. So there's a lot of good things in skill development here happening. The next slide we're looking at is looking at values and attitudes. So one of the things in the progression of building global competency is, you can have a student or a young person that has a great deal of knowledge about the world. Maybe they know where Afghanistan is and they can absolutely recite every capital and every world leader. But without these other pieces of the matrix, if they're lacking empathy, if they're lacking self-awareness, if they're lacking the ability to be sensitive and respect differences between and among cultures, those are things that are critical to supplement that knowledge. So in this example, this is also from the Media and Arts program, we had a workshop that was created as a part of that program for students, was a cut-up poetry workshop. So one of the things that is very, very effective, or we have found effective in programs, is using storytelling as a tool to be able to engage students in learning, but also really own the knowledge that they're acquiring through the process. So in this particular example, students were exploring attitudes towards custodial work. They picked a profession that they were cognizant of, that was in their environment, that they didn't know very much about as a part of this workshop. Chose the custodial staff at their school. And so what they did was they approached learning more about that profession by reading a range of articles that were both directly and tangentially related to that particular profession. So in this instance, they read job descriptions for the role itself. They read articles describing the job hazards associated with this profession. They looked at immigration and labor rights and how they dovetail with the custodial profession. And spent a lot of time diving into this, and then were asked to formulate their opinions after they had absorbed this information in response to written prompts. So this was an opportunity for them to reflect back on the learning, and then they were asked to combine those words with short articles through a spontaneous cut-up poetry technique that's borrowed from Dadaist. So it was really an opportunity, again, to make learning visible for those students, and to do it in a way that also was building what we know to be, and what we see probably most effectively, is empathy, and really valuing teaching young people that there's a lot more to most issues than you can see, and it's important to sort of dig deeper to understand stakeholder perspective. So that was a big piece of this. And then in taking the behaviors piece of that matrix, again, for folks who are joining, we're going through 4 different quadrants of a global competency matrix that we use. And just looking at some examples that evidence and show us what that looks like. What does it look like when we see global competency happening in the classroom? Or evidence in the classroom, I should say. So in this example, and you can see again here what behaviors we're looking at. And many of these behaviors, as you'll remember, you saw echoed in what was the substance of the global competency market research study that was done. So we were looking at a lot of these behaviors when we were asking questions in that study. So in this example, you have students in Santa Clara, California, at a high school, who are again participating in the challenge, which is the project-based learning model that we employ. And as a part of that, they have to create these knowledge to action plans. So again, one of the things that we think is really critical in engaging dialogue is giving students a chance to take action, to document, to take their learning and practically apply it by taking positive social action. And so the knowledge to action plan is something that is prepared by these students in the course of the program to demonstrate how would you take your solutions and implement them in an environment either at the local, national, or global level. So in this instance, these students decided to examine gender and women's access to education worldwide, and then went through the process, which is a requirement, of identifying solutions at the local, national, and global level that could apply to developing countries where there was a very limited access to education for women. And then how they chose to share this information was in a stop animation format. And so it allowed them to document their research, to show their solutions, and then to direct viewers on various avenues to take action. They also created a website which served as a portal to disseminate this video, but then also to encourage discourse among others, people that they weren't able to reach directly through participation in the challenge, but could easily do by using a website. So this is sort of a nice illustration of how they're seeking out multiple perspectives and opinions. They're forming opinions based on the exploration and evidence. They're taking informed action on an issue that matters to them, and then they're taking steps to share knowledge and encourage discourse around that issue. So there are many more examples, and I should point out actually that Taylor Watson, who I think is in this room as well, is leading a session. I believe it's at 2 p.m. Central or 6 GMT on Thursday. Charmaine may need to correct me if I'm wrong, but and we'll post a link in the chat room to that session, which actually will be co-led with students from this high school that talk about how they went through the process of conducting the research and identifying solutions, and then finding a format to share those solutions. So that's something that will be shared tomorrow. So what I'd like to do next, and actually this last slide is meant to encapsulate some of the best practices that we're seeing based on a few goals that we have at World Savvy, is to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that have really worked for us. Okay, and I see that Charmaine shared the link to the session with Taylor, so I encourage you all to listen to that as well. So I mentioned in the beginning that one of the things I think is critical in kind of effectively creating environments that are geared towards global competency for teaching and learning is the integration. Is really integrating it and really thinking about it in an interdisciplinary way. Global competency is itself interdisciplinary, I mean, as we've sort of seen walking through that matrix, and so it logically follows that when it's done very well in school environments or learning environments generally, that it is approaching that and coming at it from a variety of different areas, and so that's something that's pretty important to us. And so I would say overall that is a best practice and a strategy that has been quite effective for us. But in walking through some of the goals, one of the first goals that's really important is if you want to integrate global competency into teaching and learning, then you really need to enhance and develop and increase educator capacity to integrate this into instruction in a meaningful way. So there's probably lots of teachers in the chat room, or we know a lot of teachers, and we work with thousands of teachers. This is it's critical to be doing this in partnership to help support those teachers. They are beleaguered by the lots of different things that get thrown at them in a given year, and staying abreast of different strategies and content and topics to integrate is a difficult thing to do. And so educator capacity is pretty important. So when we think about strategies to do that, one of the things that we like to do is include them as stakeholders in that planning. So we work with them almost in a coaching model, but really more in partnership during the course of a year, so that there's multiple opportunities for teachers to understand how the knowledge that they're acquiring is at play in the classroom and how that's working, and that they have a lot of say in that. That's pretty important to us. providing time for reflection. I referenced this again at the bottom of this slide. It just couldn't be more important. Again, because global competency really is sort of an aspirational concept that literally the definition sort of changes as your environment changes. What it means to be globally competent is very dependent on the environment. And so the opportunity to provide continuous and thoughtful reflection with teachers is important to do. And then the last that we've pointed out is opportunities to build human and social capital. So anyone who works in professional development, there's been some great research. The Stanford Social Innovation Review came out with a great article last fall around sort of the most effective educators that had both human and social capital. So in that survey, they asked teachers, where do you learn the most about how to improve results in your classroom? And the majority of teachers who were experiencing success indicated from other teachers. And so, as many of you who spend time in schools know, there's limited opportunity to do that in a structured way. And so rather than passing off curriculum about global issues, that opportunity for teachers to go beyond building the human capital and the knowledge base and working with one another and learning from one another is pretty important. So those are just some of the strategies that are employed to reach that goal of enhancing educator capacity. The second is around student interest and engagement. And so I'll just highlight a few things that we believe are really critical in this piece. The first is to highlight those real-world applications. Making something tangible and sticky for students seems to be just critical in helping to engage them in the learning process. And so that's something that most of our programs work very hard to do. And the way that it's done is really looking at that emphasis on solutions and the implementation. What does this look like when I'm applying my knowledge in the world? How am I applying it, and to what and where? So in our programs you see that come up again and again because it's something that students need practice and that needs to be illuminated for them. The second is around creating tangible, personal, and local connections. So our demographic of students, many of them, when we're working with them, have not yet traveled outside the U.S. And so really kind of travel is an essential part, I think, of developing global competency, but there are ways within the United States and pretty much anywhere, but particularly in the U.S. where we were mainly focused in this presentation, almost every local community is becoming global. And so if census data is telling us anything about the direction things are going, you can use your community as a classroom wherever you are to sort of leverage that diversity as an asset in a teaching tool. And so finding ways to make that, and that again makes it extremely personal and local for students to see. And the third is around providing opportunities to take action. So I referenced this in the first point, but a really important way to say that you can take that knowledge and leverage it into something that really does begin to see, you begin to create change, and that you as an individual have a sense of agency around that notion. And the last point, and then I'll sort of sum up and see if there are some questions, is a lot of the work that we've done in this third area has been to suggest that for global competency to be done very well, there's a lot of work at the systems level that we'd like to see more of and that we've been doing for the past several years that gets you more to this holistic integration of global competency into the entire ecosystem, into the educational environment as a whole. And there's a couple pitfalls and things we've seen that have hindered that or impeded that in some way, and others that have really lent itself well to making that happen. The first is that it's important to make this commitment something explicit at a very high level, at a systems level, that it's documented not just in a strategic plan, but that the explicit commitment to developing global competency flows through other policies and other communication, other written documentation within that environment that suggests what the value system is at that school. So that's an important piece of it. The second is around taking an asset-based approach. One of the things that we've encountered in the past is that we've worked with schools that have said global competency is very important to us and we want to get going on it, and we put it in our strategic plan, and potentially that the stakeholder group included in the development of the strategic plan may have left out an important piece. And in this particular case I'm thinking of, it was teachers. And so what happened was this school didn't really have an effective or a comprehensive understanding of what the strengths were and what could be leveraged that already existed in their community. So there were a lot of teachers in that process that felt like, I've been doing really interesting stuff that gets at global competency development for years, and I do something on the side within the community that could enhance that, and there was no effort to understand what the assets to achieve that goal were within the school of community, and I think it served to work against this goal of really integrating global competency at the highest level. This focus on integration rather than enrichment, this is not a nod to after school time, out of school time programming is essential, and it plays a terrific role in youth development, and I think it's very important. But I think global competency for so long has been treated as a nice to have rather than a need to have, and something that's sort of siloed rather than a lens through which you view all of your the instructional pedagogy, everything. And so when it isn't integrated but it's considered enrichment, you tend to reach only a very small margin, and that becomes problematic. And it also leaves it vulnerable to be cut and when times are difficult. And then the last thing, again, I can't really stress enough the importance of continuous reflection. So again, I'll have Charmaine sort of sum up some of the questions or maybe some of the themes that are coming out of the chat room so that I can dive deeper or try and speak to some of those points. But the reality is this really governs our entire philosophy around thinking about global competency, what it means, how it's evidenced, where do we see it, because we are functioning in an environment that is so dynamic, and that everything that is in that matrix is subject to that constantly shifting environment. And so it's really important that there's continuous reflection on progress. So that's something that we build in a lot of ways. And what I would say is, from an organizational standpoint, the way that we do that is we do that through assessment, global competency surveys, and some quantitative measures. But it's incredibly difficult to quantify something like empathy, as many of the folks in the room would probably agree. And so adding to that the qualitative indicators that help us reflect on that at various points and understand what this looks like. We also do internal reflection for our own team. So we do something quarterly called the reflective practice that helps us to understand how our team is evolving in the service of providing these programs that focus on global competency. So there's a lot of different ways that happens, and that I think I can't state it enough. It needs to be embedded into any plan. And so that sort of sums up, that wraps up the presentation. And the last slide is just sort of inviting some questions, or certainly for you to contact us, me directly, or us, and what you will see on the website for partner teachers. Okay, there's some questions. So I'm going to take a couple of questions that are appearing here. Providing extra time for reflection for partner teachers, which, as I mentioned, I know we know how difficult that is. Working that into the school day. So there are aspects of the program that sort of embed reflection into the actual curriculum. So it is a part of, if you are doing a unit or a project like the Cut Up Poetry Workshop, that part of that sort of embeds reflection into that. And that's done jointly from teachers and students. But in our coaching with teachers, that's sort of the cornerstone of one of the first things that we do is reflect with them when we're meeting with them. And our staff, many of them who are in this room, are actually meeting on site at schools with teachers to be able to do that. What makes that question difficult to answer is that every school is different in terms of what their scheduling is and how generously they allot either common planning time or these kinds of opportunities. So that can be difficult. The other thing that we did, which was actually sort of a voluntary commitment on the part of teachers, is we did we called them math labs in the Media and Arts program, where Project Zero did a lot of this work, where you essentially came in the model using doctors doing rounds, came in with a piece of student work that teachers together sort of began with that as the central point, critiquing and discussing and talking about as a way to learn from one another and build social capital. I'm not sure if I answered that question fully, but it's embedded into the entire trajectory of the program. Okay, we have a question about how we are funded. So World Savvy's work is actually funded in a few ways. Right now, it's about half of our is individual constituents. So we have individual donors that range from $10 to $100,000 plus that fund the work. We also are funded in part by the State Department. That's just shy of 20% of funding because of the size of the grant taking students to Bangladesh and Peru. And then the remainder is institutional funding from foundations and corporate, and a small percentage of earned revenue. So less than 8% of our total revenue comes from fees, and we do charge nominal fees in each of the programs, with the exception of the international exchange program. That's 100% free. So we have another question. Can we talk a little bit about how we assess global competency? Yes. So this is, I can kind of let you into a window of how we approach doing this. About 4 years ago, we decided to sort of re-examine. We had been doing for a very long time essentially pre- and post-program assessments, where we added questions into those assessments, self-reporting from students and teachers about the knowledge acquisition, the skill development, the attitudinal shift, and the behavior shift. But we felt like that was it wasn't enough, and that's not the only way you get information, and self-reporting can be challenging. So we started working with an evaluation expert named Dr. Michael Quinn Patton, who works, his evaluation framework is a developmental evaluation framework, and in a very, very short nutshell, developmental evaluation is appropriate in context of dynamism. So when environments are changing, when there's multiple types of integration, it's useful for that, and it really lends itself to continuous reflection and assessment rather than assessing something once in the beginning of the year and once at the end, which I would say, that strategy for assessing global competence didn't work very well. So what we did was we kept those program surveys in place so that we had an idea there was valuable information there about the type of intervention we were using that we wanted to glean. But then we created a separate quantitative base, so we created another survey tool that took a list of questions around, mainly at that point focused on attitudes and behaviors that were pulled from the indicators within the Global Competency Survey. So that survey was actually given to all students, irrespective of whether they were in an arts program or whether they were in a project-based learning program, because in evaluating global competency in those contexts, to a certain degree, we want to know, does project-based learning create global competency or build skills better than the arts integration approach? And so in this case, we actually gave that survey pre and post in the first year that was meant to just be a global competency assessment tool. And the second year, we moved to having the entire cohort do that as a retrospective pre-post, and then took a subset of that total group and did more intensive, we did pre-post surveys with them and then did intensive evaluation. So what we found is evaluating global competency with that quantitative method had a lot of administration issues. We were going through teachers to administer them, so the pre-post period was difficult to maintain. So the second year when we made adjustments allowed us to capture that, and we got a lot better data. But beyond assessing global competencies through those tools, we also incorporated a lot of qualitative data. So we produced a number of case studies that walked through. You saw a really, really brief glimpse in this presentation of sort of examples of what students did, but we spent a lot of time documenting case studies in a more robust way to say, let's see, what does it look like when this is happening on the ground, so that we could triangulate the data that we were coming in to create a fuller picture. What we have not yet done, which I think would be incredibly valuable, and there are some people that I think are moving more towards this, is to actually, in that triangulation of data, to use to use, sorry, I was just looking at another question, got distracted, to be able to utilize, and I lost my train of thought. Sorry, I saw another question come up. Okay, I'm going to move on. We only have 9 minutes, so I'll take the next question. Sorry, what I can say is, Charmaine, perhaps you can send a link to the page on our website that dives into more about the developmental evaluation and some of the other things referenced. That might be helpful for folks. Excuse me. So the next question, okay, sorry. What about the teacher's assessment of the students? Okay, so this is a great question. How do teachers use what we assess in school? So one of the things that we can post a link to, I believe we can post a link to it, I'm actually not sure, I have to find that out, but one of the ways that teachers use formulated grades was in the World Savvy Challenge. I'll use that as an example. These students are doing research all year long, and then they come to a culminating event where there is a very specific rubric that is used by external judges, so in this case assessors, to document how they've done in certain areas. So in the case of the challenge, they're looking at things, they're looking at their substantive research, was it thorough? Did they cite a lot of sources? They're looking at their creativity. How did they frame the research that they came up with in a way that was compelling? And then in presentation as well. So clarity of presentation and things around team building. So did they include everyone in that? Were they able to find a way to engage their entire group as opposed to having one take over? So that rubric is actually, there is a rated scale that's used by judges, and those are all returned to teachers. So many of the teachers in our programs actually use those rubrics to formulate grades. So they have research and rationale is assessed, looking at everything about every aspect of what they've done, understanding of the theme, multiple perspectives, connections to history and current events, the global scope, and then the feasibility of the solutions. So that's a piece of it. There are other creative ways. Not all teachers integrate this into grading in the same way, but this is a very concrete way using those rubrics from the challenge that teachers are able to do it. And all of the feedback from these external viewers is actually sent back to teachers so that there is, in addition to having raw scores from these events, they also have comments. They have sort of other kind of commentary to guide their students. And I will say, in a lot of these programs, they're very process focused, which seems to work much better. But the output, the outcome, what comes out of the other side, there are easy ways to sort of judge the quality. The way you would judge the quality of a student presentation in any context, that comes into play because there is such a visible outcome from programming. And that's true with all the different kinds of programs. Is there anything else in the chat? Oh, is it, okay. This one, okay. So it looks like Charmaine may have answered the question about utilizing the Global Competency Matrix and connection to Asia Society, which I think is a fantastic model. I'm a big fan of Asia Society, and I think it's related, but they are not, we're not using that matrix in our work, but it obviously contains a lot of very similar things in our evaluation. It doesn't look like there are more questions that I'm seeing in my moderator link. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone that was able to join us this morning, and it's just really a privilege to be able to talk about this work, and I hope that I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and a big thanks to Steve and Lucy again for putting this together. Okay, signing off. Thanks, everyone.